Hi, everyone. Welcome back to an episode of, I think, the Psychological Bible. I'm not sure if I've changed the name yet or what I'm going to be talking about. I did come up with a new name, Symbols in the Dark, because I think one of the ideas that I had is this idea of so many symbols and so many different aspects of ancient literature, biblical literature, and symbols in the dark is meant to represent this idea that there are many of these symbols and these ideas at play, but they seem to be kind of lurking more in the dark, if you will. And part of the idea of this channel is to bring some of those to light. And I think the conversation today is not necessarily trying to bring one of these to light, um, but it is to speak about something that I've been noticing quite a bit, and it's really fascinating actually, which is the whole carnivore movement, but within Christianity. And I think there's a lot to talk about here, but and so I won't just be focusing on the carnivore side of it, but even just talking about meat as a whole in general. I think it's worth a discussion. So this kind of sparked for me a little bit because I came across some Facebook groups of Christian carnivores or Christians for carnivore. I've also been seeing a lot of these posts recommended to me in my algorithm, and some of them are by I forget his name. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's Paul Salandino or something of that nature. But just then, kind of taking a look at the comments and seeing the amount of Christians in the comments talking about that this is that this is the way to be, and this is like what's meant for humans, and this is what humans have evolved for. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I find that this is one of those, again, like kind of consistent contradictions within the Christian realm. I think it's very similar to how, like, on one hand, Christians want to, you know, put the Ten Commandments and things like that into the schools. Yet at the same time, there's this idea that the law has been done away with, and only some of them matter, or to a certain extent. It gets really confusing, and I find there's a lot of hypocrisy, right? And I think this is one of those. And it's kind of interesting, I had recently watched the movie or the documentary Game Changers, and I had never seen it before. I had heard a bit about it. I seen a debate on Joe Rogan with the main person from Game Changers and some other person that was, I don't know what their status was. I think they were some sort of scientist. And in watching Game Changers, it really was interesting to note a couple of things that I want to touch on. I think the first thing is that a lot of this whole carnivore diet um, roots itself in the idea that humans have evolved and the humans evolve. Um, but particularly that one of the mechanisms throughout time was that humans evolved by eating meat, and that meat consumption was one of those big aspects of, the hunter-gatherer societies and things of that nature. And so, I mean, that's one of the first points of contention that I have with this whole topic, because if you think about the biblical narrative, which is the idea that humans were already created, humans did not evolve to a certain capacity, but humans were already created with a capacity. This idea that humans used meat to be able to ascend to different categories in development, and um, as Homo sapiens and mammals and all that whole conversation. When you hear Christians talk about that this is our ancestral diet and this is how our ancestry ate, it's kind of interesting. It's like it's very it's very confusing, given that the biblical narrative is the story of people who never ate meat. Meat consumption, as far as the biblical narrative is concerned, came as a consequence of sin, as part of the fall, because there was no death beforehand. So this idea of meat eating in heaven or in the garden is just, I mean, it's beyond ridiculous, because it stipulates the idea that there was death. And if you go back to Genesis, you read that the original diet, if anything, was a plant-based diet. There was no death, there was no blood, there was any of those things. In fact, the it, itself, um, the meat came as it came as not a thing that God wanted. It was a compromise, mostly, though part of it had to do with the um, the Genesis account of after the fall, not after the fall, but after the flood, that there was nothing to eat, and God said that they could eat animals, and certain animals that were clean and unclean, but that was not God's plan. And so it's really not until that aspect or to that part in Genesis where they're able to or given the ability to eat meat. And so that's one part of it, but also one of the things that you learn from um, the Game Changers documentary, or just again like Christian literature, which seems to bring everything together, is this idea that the human body was not designed for meat consumption. And I think this is where, Christians have a very difficult, you know, it's a very interesting um, juxtaposition, if you will, because the proposition that is put by the scientists and game changers and others is the idea that, again, humans were actually not our bodies are not designed for meat consumption or meat eating, which very directly aligns with the biblical narrative that the human body was not designed to eat meat, but meat came as a sort of no other option type thing when the flood had taken place. And so um, when you read about Christians saying this is our ancestral diet and this is the way that we ought to eat and this is the way that we should live, it's actually feeding into the evolutionary view of human existence, and that we evolved and we're just like other animals that eat meat. But there's a great plethora of other scientists and literature that suggests that the human body was not created, and part of that argument is looking at the intestine and the length of our intestine, large, small intestine, and what they're able um, to digest and be able to consume properly. So that's one aspect of it, right? And you also learn from that documentary, and it opens the door to look at other literature and other aspects that show that, in the past, like as far as we can see in the records, it's a stretch to say that the primary form of consumption for humans was meat. In fact, we can see that some of the earliest people that we can go back to thousands of years ago had a high vegetarian diet or high vegetable diet, and they even speak about that documentary as far as the gladiators, that they were primarily vegetarian, eating small amounts of meat. And so, what I have noticed to say, it's like this carnivore diet has become very like attached to the right wing conservative movement, and by extension of Christians sort of being adjacent to those movements have accepted a lot of these ideas that are counterintuitive to the biblical narrative, and at the same time create harm and uphold ideas that don't necessarily unite us, but in some sense divide us, right? You can think about one of the things that I see so often today is this conversation around, AI and its massive usage of water, right? And it's interesting. I mean, it's true. But on the other hand, the largest consumption of water usage in the world, one of the largest, if it's not the top two, it's top three, top four, top five, is for growing animals for consumption, right? So cows, pigs, chickens, all of that are some of the biggest um, users of water in our ecosystem, which is it's fascinating, right? And so there is like an aspect of environmental conservation that goes into even understanding that the to preserve life, or not to preserve life, but there is an aspect of that, but to bring life, to keep it alive, to be able to eat it afterwards is something that does consume a lot of water, and something that we should really pay attention to. I find it really interesting when now conservative Christians are against vegans and they make fun of vegans. I've seen sermons where, the pastor is making fun of people that eat meat. I mean, sorry, that are vegetarian, and saying, oh, they're all like weak and that's not what our ancestors ate and that's what we should not be eating. It's like, I mean, are we reading the same book? Because we seem to, at least the evangelical, I wouldn't say all of them, but seem to be upholding evolutionary view of the human, and and by extension pushing a lot of these ideas and pushing a lot of other people out. And I would say vegans and vegetarians are closer, if anything, than many Christians to understanding what the ideal is or was for humanity. And I think it's something that we should be striving for. Um, so, I kind of wanted to kind of call that out, at least, start a conversation around this idea that, Christians are saying this is our original diet. I mean, I think the evidence suggests that, at least there's a good evidence that suggests that meat eating is not our original diet. The Bible suggests it's not our original diet. And I think the question that Christians have to ask yourself is who's their authority at the end of the day, right? Is it Paul Salandino and some of these individuals that are part of this carnivore movement? Or is it the text in the scripture that you claim to uphold, right? And is it literally true? Like, were they literally vegans in the garden? Or do we believe that that's just a story? And you may believe that that is just a story, but then you also have to be careful about your claims as, to be a Christian and to uphold some of these ideas. And I think, if anything, what we should be striving for is a return back to the garden, a return back to Eden, which would promote um, a lot of the types of diets that you see in vegans and vegetarians. And I think that the issue has been there's been so much propaganda, there's been so much brainwashing in America in particular, from, I'm going to say, big milk and big meat in the United States for a very long time, to push the idea that you have to eat meat and that this is the way to be and that this is how our ancestors ate and this is how strong people are, when there are plenty of very strong people, bodybuilders, athletes, that uphold a vegan diet. Um, so, I want to put a challenge, and, if I doubt anyone's interested in having a conversation or um, some discourse around this idea that's Christian and believes that this is our original diet and this is what we should promoting. But I think as a consequence of that, we've become so against the things that are quite important. As an example, animal rights. We tend to align the idea of animal rights with liberalism and the Democrats, or people of such association, when, again, if you study the biblical narrative, I mean, even in the Old Testament with the Sabbath and other commands, the animal was meant to rest. It was not meant to work 24/7. Not only were the animals not supposed to work 24/7, you were not supposed to put a heavy burden on animals. And if you were to consume animals, there was a sense of, which I think is, largely missing. There was a sense of understanding of the value of the animal that had to give its life for you. And so not only were, God had instructed them not to eat the blood of the animals, right? And that's part of the kosher laws. And um, the blood was meant to be drained, and it was an understanding that the life was in the blood, and it was meant to be a symbol of the value of the blood that needed to be shed for you to be sustained. And I think today the way that we consume animals, and as Christians, and not just the mistreatment of animals and the continuation of the mistreatment by not aligning ourselves with movements that actually protect animals and take care of animals, and maybe suggest to say that we should not be mass producing all of these animals, and even maybe push back on many of these claims that have been propaganda to suggest that, we are carnivores by nature and this is the way that we ought to live and this is the way that we should be. We yet spend our time pushing against vegetarians, pushing against vegans, and if anything, like um, mocking them and alienating such groups, which I would say, I mean, vegans and vegetarians are probably some of the most right people to be Christians, because they sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with the fact that the life of an animal has to die, and that has to happen. And I understand some of the arguments on the other side that, well, animals eat other animals, and that's true. I mean, just as humans kill other humans, and of course we don't necessarily eat the other humans, But those animals have uh, certainly adapted to be able to consume such things. And part of it is the understanding that the hierarchy for the animal kingdom has been disturbed because the human used to sit on top of it and be the ruler, the delegator, the one who would appoint roles and to oversee them, and they have lost their leader. Just as, in the biblical narrative, we've lost our leader. So I think Christians really need to check the hypocrisy, but also realize the types of ideas that you are uplifting by suggesting that this is our original diet, that carnivore is the way to be, and that vegetables and all that kind of stuff are bad for us. Not only are you putting down the things that God pushed as the original diet, or not necessarily pushed, but created us to be, you're also alienating the science and the evidence that suggests that that is exactly how we ought to live. And then we, by extension, uphold some of the counter evidence, counter science. I would ask ourselves, like, should we go to Paul Salandino? Should we go to insert the name of, whatever like influencer meat carnivore person is today that tells you that you shouldn't have that you shouldn't eat meat. I mean, that you should eat meat and that it's the best for the body, which in reality, a lot of the times why it works is simply because of it's an elimination diet and you're cutting a lot of the garbage that you're constantly eating. And I would suggest that if you were to do that already and include vegetables and many of these things, you would be healthy, you would be fine. But many of us have bought the lie that eating organic, healthy, homegrown vegetables and getting natural protein somehow puts you at a deficit. Um, I think these are the thoughts that I wanted to share. I just been seeing so much of it. I'll put some of those kind of things up on in this video just so that you can see. Um, but I think as a result of Christianity always getting politicized and also lack of understanding of the Old Testament and thinking that these things don't matter anymore, not only have we continued to promote the mass farming of animals, the destruction of the earth, which, by the way, again, in the biblical narrative, the earth and the land was supposed to get a rest. Every 7 years is supposed to get a rest for a year. And that would have included the animals who were plowing that land, right? Um, so is meat eating our ancestral diet? Is that true? Or is that just nonsense that continues to feed online? Should Christians be against veganism, vegetarianism, and be promoting carnivore diets? This, if you believe the biblical narrative, in Revelation it says that the lamb will lay down with the sheep and that there will be no more death, no more sorrow. Do you really think that there's going to be meat eating in heaven? I mean, if those are the ideas that we're striving for, if we're pushing towards an Eden, should we not at the same time strive to those things and uplift those things and promote and support those who believe such ideas and not bring them down or not put them down because of those beliefs? And should we at the same time be uplifting individuals who do not believe in God, who believe in an evolutionary story of our origins, who believe that the human has teeth to eat meat and puncture meat and rip meat, when we see chimpanzees and other animals that are just eating um, vegetables, fruits, grains, nuts, all these types of things? Um, I would say that Christians have bought the lie of carnivorism, and it's about time that Christians really start to stand up for the stories, the biblical stories of our true origins and our true diet, and move away from these individuals that don't really know the biblical story. So I wanted to share that with you and hope that that sparks a conversation for you. Have a good day.